final straight, and Jim Reynolds is our next speaker. He spent 20 years of his time researching many issues in which he's published over 60 peer-reviewed papers, and he's been at the University of Birmingham since 2003. His roots are in terrestrial bird species, but he's turned to seabirds in more recent years, specifically on Ascension Island, as you can see him there in the photograph, since he acts as a scientific advisor to the Army Ornithological Society, and he regularly participates in their expeditions to the island, and that is what he's going to tell us about today. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jim Reynolds.
No? Right, thank you very much, Keith. Let me first of all say thank you for inviting me to give this talk at such a prestigious meeting. It was only a couple of years ago that actually I was invited to become an honorary member of the Army Ornithological Society, having been, hopefully, an able scientific advisor over the years. So I now use the Army Ornithological Society as a joint affiliation. And what I want to do is sort of take you on a seabird journey this afternoon. So, become a big fan of these word clouds. These word clouds allow you to provide the audience with a flavour of what you're going to talk about for the next half an hour, and it's based upon the word cloud that some individuals might get up and leave at this point. But anyway, what I'm going to do is talk to you principally about population ecology, and I want to talk to you about the threats to Ascension sooty terns particularly. So if you're going to pull some words off this word cloud, I'd suggest things like rats and common miners, population density, and cats as well. So that's just to give you a flavour. And I thought, with it being 20 years, this meeting, I thought I would try to sum up what's been going on Ascension Island for the last 20 years. Let me first of all say the reason why I'm standing here and the reason why I'm talking about Ascension Island is thanks to a PhD student of mine, John Hughes, who's actually in the audience today, along with a lot of the other AOS members. And John is the common link between these two photographs. So this is 1990, and here's John in a very fetching, I don't know what it is. Don't know what it is, if it's a polo shirt or rugby shirt, I don't know. But the other reason I put this up was because I thought it was quite interesting to pull out some of the other characters off that photograph. And some of you will know, hopefully, the name of Philip Ashmole, because Philip Ashmole wrote a lot of really important papers about population regulation, particularly about seabirds. And there's notable names like Hilary Nash there as well in that 1990 expedition. And then we come to the present day, 2012, which is this motley crew. And I'm actually pictured here, and here's John again, looking no older than he does here, really. I don't know what his secret is. Maybe he's going to sell that later at the end of this meeting. But the other thing I wanted to draw your attention to was that in 20 years, the work ethic has clearly changed. Here's everybody raring to go in the sun with vehicles, and here's us fueled by Castle Lager. At the administrator's residence, no less, but still. But this is not 9 o'clock in the morning, this is 9 o'clock in the evening, so we do get out there. So what and where is Ascension? And there's a much more important point in addition to where it is and what it is, and that's that on the way down here. I was reading a government white paper published in February this year, which has suggested that actually, despite the fact we've got 14 UK overseas territories, and despite the fact they support nearly 90% of our biodiversity in the UK, they have received something like 0.3% of the research money available for biodiversity research. So that's pretty shocking, I think. So that's my political point made. Moving on to geography. So we have a number of UK overseas territories. And also in this government white paper I was reading, you add up all the people in these UK overseas territories, they come to 250,000 people. That's about the size of Nottingham City's population. So maybe it's because they are far removed, such as the Pitcairn Islands and even Ascension down here, and St Helena and Tristan da Cunha, which is one territory. Maybe it's out of sight, out of mind, the reason why Ascension has not received the attention it should have done. So one of the things I hope to do today is to try to put Ascension back into sort of people's sights into a sharp focus. So it's part of the air bridge, and to get to Ascension, some of you will have gone to the Falkland Islands, no doubt. You fly from RAF Price Norton to Ascension, and then you fly onto the Falklands. 10 hours roughly between each destination. So why is Ascension important? Depends on the audience you talk to. Obviously, it's the African Bird Club audience I'm talking to today, but actually, Ascension is important for many reasons other than just birds as well. So let me just touch on the non-avian reasons why Ascension is important. Ascension is militarily very important still. The US and the UK armed forces still have big presences on Ascension. The telecommunications industry sees Ascension as really important. The BBC has a relay station on Ascension which services South America and much of Africa. The French have a satellite tracking station on Ascension. The space shuttle program from the US used to have it in their sights that if they overshot the US landmass with the space shuttle, it could land on the runway at Ascension. And historically, Ascension was really important as a staging post for American operations servicing North Africa during the war effort, during the Second World War. From an avian perspective and seabirds, it's a real goldmine. It has some real enigmatic seabird species. So it's got brown noddy and black noddy. Brown noddies we work on quite a lot because they're easy to get to when they're reproducing. Black noddies we don't work on so much because we can't get to their nests, and I'm a reproductive biologist and I'd love to work on eggs and chicks. You just can't get to them. Ooh. We've also got white terns, brown boobies, white-tailed tropic birds, red-billed tropic birds. We've got Ascension frigate bird, which is the island endemic, which is the focus of much conservation action. Mast boobies. The odd one out here is common myna, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about invasive species and what a problem they've been on Ascension. And the understated in this collage of a slide, the understated species is sooty tern. When we break down the avian community of Ascension, we note that obviously much of the RSPB's attention on Ascension has been because of the Ascension frigate bird. It's the endemic. You wanted to work on red-footed boobies, however, you wouldn't go to Ascension to work on them. There's not enough of them there. But there are significant numbers of the other two booby species. We've done some work on white-tailed tropic birds. We're interested in the phylogeography of white-tailed tropic birds. We've got ongoing research with brown noddies. We're interested to see why brown noddies appear to be coming back to Ascension Island and appear to be timing their breeding seasons with sooty tern breeding seasons. You go, wow, why is that interesting? I'll tell you in a minute why that is quite interesting, because there's an interesting finding about the length of the subannual, it's a subannual breeding cycle in sooty terns. But the bottom bullet point here is these introduced species. So canaries and waxbills and francolins are interesting to go and count around the island, interesting from a censusing point of view. But common myna has been the focus of ongoing research questions, conservation-based questions. Why should we worry about common mynas? And I'll show you in a minute why they're a real problem. But the avian biomass pyramid, if you like, is dominated by sooty terns. 380,000 sooty terns breed on Ascension. On average, 380,000. Making it about 95% of avian biomass on the island. Sooty terns are not globally threatened, however. They're least concern. If you go to BirdLife International's website, you will find that they number 23 to 25 million birds. So people say to me, well, why do you work on sooty terns? What's the interest? Apart from the fact it gets me to lovely places like Ascension Island, there's some key conservation issues and questions that can be answered working on sooty terns. They breed in huge colonies transequatorially. So you can find sooty terns right through the Pacific, in islands like Guam. We find them through North America, so we find them from Florida. There's a very famous long-term study of the dry tortugas population off Key West. We find them in Ascension and the Caribbean. There's big populations in the Caribbean. Perhaps the most well-characterized sooty tern population is here, which is Chris Fear's work on Bird Island in the Seychelles, where he's got upwards of 2 million birds breeding. And then we find them right the way across through to Cairns off the Australian coast. So they are, where they are, they appear in large numbers. What I hope to show you in the next 25 minutes is that actually the sooty tern population on Ascension may well be declining very, very rapidly, and we need to learn some lessons very quickly about population stability and decline if we're to not see this species banging on the door of being endangered in, say, 40 or 50 years' time. You'll go, that sounds like a very short time frame, but I'll show you how much the population has declined to date in the last 40 or 50 years. So where do we work on sooty terns on Ascension? Well, this is a satellite image. You can see guano deposits in the bottom southwest corner of the island. The island is about 7 miles by 4 miles. Here is the landing strip, and here's Georgetown, the capital, up here. We work in Mars Bay and Waterside. Waterside has about 2/3 of the birds breeding, and Mars Bay has about 1/3. The Army Ornithological Society was the reason I started going to Ascension, and I first went there in 2008. So I feel like a bit of a newcomer. I'm the spokesman of the AOS really for this afternoon. But work focused on Ascension many years before that. So the British Ornithology Union centenary expedition went to Ascension in 1957 for 18 months. And it was from that expedition that we learned a lot about the population biology of the species. And it was a guy called James Chapin back in 1954 who published a paper about this really unusual 9.6-month breeding periodicity of the population of sooty terns. And Philip Ashmole, who was on this original BOU expedition back in 1957, he published a lot of key papers from that 18 months on the island. And in it, he suggested that there was the possibility that individual birds, too, were breeding subannually. But we never really got definitive empirical data to support that statement beyond those 2 breeding seasons that he documented. So, in the time that, in the last 20 years, 20 or so years, that the AOS has been going to Ascension, we don't have 500,000 birds ringed like the previous talk before T, but the ringing effort has been enormous for one species. Over 18,000 birds have been ringed. We've got a retrap effort of something like 19%. 3,500 birds have been retrapped. And one of the things we always do when we get out to the island is we spend the first few days walking through what can sometimes feel like millions of birds, but it's only ever potentially about 200,000 birds. And what we do rather manically is stare at the legs to try to look at rings. We find a bird ringed, we catch it, we read the ring number, we take GPS coordinates. So we've got blood samples, we've got biometrics from many of these birds. We're interested in the big ecological variables that you want to measure. So we take things like levels of predation, predator abundance, the demographics. So one of the key parameters is what's the size of this population between breeding seasons. And we look at life history because it looks like Ascension sooty terns are doing quite a lot of things differently in terms of life history than other sooty terns around the globe. Can't skip this image without saying there's a motley crew there leaning at the sign of Mars Bay. But this is proof. You need it. I'm looking at a male-dominated audience here. Males can multitask in this picture here. This is one of the volunteers from the Conservation Office, and what he's doing is he's ringing a bird, smoking a cigarette, and drinking a cup of tea all at the same time, which is pretty impressive. All 3 of them, some would say he's doing badly, but still. And the other person who's not here today, but is Colin Wern, who's been ringing, along with Roger Dickey, has been ringing on Ascension for a very, very long time, but here, white-tailed tropic bird is getting the better of it. So this is a sort of a life history, natural history sort of slide, just to remind me to tell you a few important things about sooty terns. They're a classic K-selected seabird, essentially. We think that sooty terns on Ascension don't breed potentially for the first 7, 8, maybe 9 years of their lives, so they fledge, and they're gone. And that's a big deal because we don't know where these birds are going. But what they do is they come back, and we know when they come back and what age they are, because sometimes we get birds coming back and we retrap them with rings on their legs. We've never seen that bird before. It doesn't mean it hasn't bred previously, but we can at least estimate age at first breeding for some of these birds if they're ringed pre-fledging. They are typical terns in the sense that in the bottom left-hand corner, I don't trust this, it keeps flicking forwards, male and female over a chick there. Very difficult to tell them apart. And for some of the tracking work we've been doing, we need to know what sex these birds are. So what we do is we blood sample them. We've got molecular ways of telling the sex of birds. These are cute little 5-day-old, maybe a bit older, chicks. And what they do is they crash. They crash under volcanic rocky ledges and under the plant invasive, the Mexican thorn, which we find, despite it's a damn nuisance and it's encroaching on the sooty tern colonies, is a great crashing site for these birds, although they're not very well protected. And then we've got birds at 2 months of age in the top right-hand corner. They're just ready to fledge, essentially. But then we've got an orangey dashed line between them and the breeding birds, because we don't know at the moment, we don't have very good estimates on recruitment success. So what's the likelihood if you fledge successfully from ascension, you're going to come back and breed? But I guess the bad news is that ascension and the sooty tern population study at large is a story of predation. So it's the usual story when it comes to remote oceanic islands that we have visited with our boats, where you've got men and boats, or women and boats, you have rats, and rats are present on ascension, but so too, because of rats, are cats. So cats were brought in to control rat numbers. We've also got common miners, which again are an invasive species. Ascension frigate birds have been there since the year dot and predate chicks to a certain age. And that's one of the marvels of the natural world, is watching ascension frigate birds flying up and down looking for chicks of a size they can gulp straight down. So they pick them off the rocky substrate and fly on. And then we have below that a bit of more tiers of predators. So we have land crabs and Sally Lightfoot crabs, which take eggs. They scavenge a lot, so they'll take dead chicks. And then we've got house mice and invertebrates that are doing the hoovering, the cleaning up job, and providing the rats with a food source when the birds have gone. These are colonial nesting seabirds that synchronize their breeding efforts. I didn't go to Ascension in 1990. I was only just graduating from my undergraduate degree all those years ago. But the AOS, when they first started going down to Ascension, not only had to walk into the colonies, a grueling walk by the sound of it compared with our rather luxurious drive into the colonies these days, but they spent the first day or so, 2 days, 3 days maybe, I'm looking for nods at the back of the, clearing up fares of all of these dead adults that had been taken by cats. That was a gruesome job. Wouldn't have wanted to do that. Piling corpses up and removing them from the fairs. Many of you will know about the RSPB's efforts to eradicate cats. So between 2002 and 2004, a major effort took place. A lot of money was put into it. They eradicated cats from the fairs. We still see evidence of the occasional errant feral cat that has been wreaking havoc down on the fairs, and it's fairly easy to see it because you find, fortunately we don't see many dead adults like this, but you find a lot of birds just pre-fledging that have been killed or in the process of dying as a result of cat predation. And cats, as many of you will know if you have domestic cats at home, some cats like to kill for the sake of killing. They won't just kill and eat, and that's it. So, enough on moggy bashing. So miners, common miners, we try to keep good counts on common miners. And my heart sinks, I hope the rest of the expedition's heart sinks when we walk onto the colonies and we see against the skyline views of common miners sitting on rocks. Because what common miners do is a tremendous lot of egg damage. So they won't just take one egg and punch a hole in the blunt end of it and drink from it, they will go from egg to egg to egg, puncturing hole upon hole till they find one they like the taste of. Once you punch a hole in an egg, that's it. And that's the end of the breeding attempt. This is a species that lays one egg, so that's a lot of investment which is potentially gone. Depending upon what stage of the breeding season it is, they may well relay, but not always. So we sometimes do catch minors. We don't minor control. I don't personally minor control, but some effort has been made to kill the minors, and that's a debate we could have till the cows come home as to whether we should be eradicating minors or just controlling them. But we estimate they're destroying possibly 10% of all eggs laid on Ascension, which is a big chunk of eggs. But we've talked about cats. I would argue the rat situation is now more grave than the cat situation ever was. And that's because we've got a problem now with black rats. And it's a problem, as I was saying to somebody over lunch, it's a problem, it's applied conservation. Very often we can provide theory and come up with practical solutions to things, but conservation is about personalities. And if you don't get personalities on board to do these things that we prescribe when we're not there much of the time, we're leaving it to Ascension staff, it doesn't happen. So you see scenes like this now, whereas these scenes were not seen very often at all. These are two chicks that have been killed by rats, black rats, and they strip the back muscles out of these chicks and they take the brains out the brain cases. And they take a lot of them. So one of the key things in our work when we go to Ascension these days is to try to monitor their numbers. We can't eradicate black rats now. We may do if we could come up with an effective way of doing it, but it's not easy. So what we do at the moment is try to get a handle on how much rat predation is actually happening. And to do this, we rat trap. So we lay out lines of trap lines, and we bait traps with cornflakes and peanut butter. I don't like doing it. It's almost always a job where you draw straws and the shortest straw gets to do this. Because rats, when you get to rats this size in this photograph, and many of you, my home city of Birmingham has been talking about rats having the size of cats running around its streets recently, we do get some rats which are getting enormous, because as rats age, they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And not surprisingly, rat trapping is not effective at killing these things outright. So part of the job is finishing off rats that are caught in traps. Not pleasant. But one of the key things that we need from this work is an estimate, a relative population estimate of black rat numbers. And whereas we had estimates of 34, 36 up to 2009, this estimate, we did it recently, last time we were there was August last year, we're up at about 70 now. 70 rats caught per 100 trap nights. There's a lot of rats on Ascension. And it's a classic, what we biologists like to call a mesopredator release story. So in the top diagram, you will see that we've got cats in the mix and rats in the mix. Where you have an apex predator, you have control over the mesopredators, the mid-sized predators, if you like. And the rats don't live so long that they're going to start taking largish chicks. Whereas if you take cats out of the mix, which is the bottom series schematic diagram, you have rats that are growing, living beyond 1 or perhaps 2 breeding seasons. They're taking a lot of chicks now. And I provided just a really basic sort of calculation. Pre-cat eradication, we had 6,000 adults and 4,500 chicks taken. Post-cat eradication, 0 adults because there's nothing killing them, but maybe 38,000 chicks taken. That has a real effect at population level. Could have. So whereas before cat eradication we had perhaps 1 in every 3 birds that were fledging coming back and eventually breeding, we've maybe got losses up by about 70%. The problem is if you're working on long-lived seabird is that you need long-term study to be able to detect these things. So I'm going to make the argument, therefore, that another schematic diagram here, but here's a left of the dashed line, the black bars is population estimates based on AOS work from 1990 to about 2002, prior to cat eradication. You can see the population estimates go up and down, but the idea was that the cat eradication scheme would release this constraint on the population of sooty terns, and suddenly we'd see, with a few year lag, maybe some bounce back and recovery in the population size. I challenge anybody to see any kind of bounce back in that population size at the moment, and this is 10 years on from cat eradication scheme. At a meeting recently, I was public enemy number one at the RSPB because we were scratching our heads over these figures, and I said, I know what we need an apex predator back in Ascension. Let's put cats back there. And it was like, ooh, you could hear a pin drop in the room at that suggestion. But actually, I give a lot of talks to outside groups, and one of the things which people always ask about is, can't we get something to predate the rats again? We can talk about that. That's a really interesting point, and people have tried but failed. So, the declining population, and it is a real declining population, this is based on a few assumptions, but we have good statistical figures, we have good maps of colonies of sooty terns on Ascension Island, which suggest that even as recently as 1958, there were nearly 3 million birds on Ascension, sooty terns on Ascension. Now, 60 years on, we've lost nearly 90% of that population size. That's a population crash. I mean, one of the things, when I first went to Ascension in 2008, I was blown away by the number of birds. But the number of birds is nothing compared with what it was in 1958. So, one of the things which has driven what we've been doing very recently on Ascension has been, well, what we're doing is we're looking at a 7% snapshot of time of an adult sooty tern of their lives, because we're only looking at them when they're breeding back on Ascension. The other 93% of the time, they spend away from Ascension, pelagic seabird at sea. So how do we get a handle on what they're really doing in that 93% of time? So one of the things I've been really interested in recently, because I'm interested in food and how it drives reproductive attempts of birds, is to try to think about the foraging behaviour of this species. This is something that we're currently thinking about, is using historic photographs from Ascension to try to look at things like the nesting density of changed birds, because our population size estimates are based upon measures of the periphery of the colony, so we're mapping colony area, but for that we also need an estimate of nesting population density in order to scale things up and work out a total population size. So we've been having a bit of fun looking at these old photographs. These were in John Hughes' PhD thesis. These are really interesting old photographs, but what we're trying to do is work out how you can get good nesting density estimates off these old photographs compared with the present day. And this is a picture from 2008 where you can see nesting density, but of course it varies with the terrain. And some of these historic images are now where the the airport is, so we can't get those modern day nesting densities from the same terrain. But something I'm doing right now is thinking about whether birds have succumbed or endured a dietary shift. So we've got good observational data from Philip Ashmole's work from Ascension in 1958, where he did a lot of work where he watched adults feeding chicks and he documented what they were feeding. This is a picture of a chick here being fed by an adult squid, which is nutritionally poor as a food source. And we're estimating roughly that we're seeing about 71% less fish fed to chicks than was the case 60 years ago. That's anecdotal. There's a negative correlation, and it is, I stress, just the correlation between tuna fisheries, tuna tonnage landed versus population size. This is just a really illustrative figure to just show what the population size looks like with these purple bars of sooty terns compared with the tuna catch in tons. But I don't ever remember going to Ascension in the last 6 years and ever seeing fish this size dragged out on the dockside at Georgetown. They used to pull out tuna this size. One of the big issues about Ascension is that we don't have reliable fisheries data. So we don't know what's happened in terms of these large fish, but we suspect there's been a collapse of the tuna fishery in this area of the Atlantic. Why is that important? Because these large predatory fish are responsible for driving the small fish to the surface where the sooty terns feed. They feed in association with large predatory fish. If you do the natural sequence of biological events from this, if we've lost large predatory fish from this area of the Atlantic, we don't have so much fish available to sooty terns, they turn to alternative food sources. They don't grow as well, they don't fledge as well, and they don't recruit well to the breeding population. And again, illustratively here, but these are examples of regurgitants over us. In December 2012, you pick up an incubating sooty tern or a sooty tern that's loafing about when it's got a young chick. You can pick them up, and sometimes they will cough up what they've eaten all over you. And you can collect this material. It's a lovely savoury job. But what we're hoping is they'd all be coughing up these kind of food items. But we were getting some very bizarre foods coughed up over us. So we got marine snails, locusts, squid, and Sally Lightfoot crabs, these tiny little crabs. These can't be nutritionally rich. And many of you who are into your seabirds will know about the story, Sarah Wanless's story up in Scotland of pipefish appearing in birds' diets more and more and more. We've seen an explosion in pipefish numbers in the North Sea, for instance. And pipefish, like these food items, is not nutritionally rich. So what I'm currently doing, I'm going to Portugal next month to work with Jaime Ramos at the University of Coimbra, and what we've done is we've been looking at historical collections of sooty tern feathers taken from Ascension from 1880 to the present day, and we're trying to use stable isotope analysis to reconstruct diet, with a lot of caveats with an analysis like that. But we're interested to see whether there's been a prey shift in sooty terns over the last 130 years, which could perhaps account for this decline in the population size at Ascension. So we're looking to see whether there's been a trophic shift in what these birds have been feeding on. Watch this space for that. On Tuesday last week, we published a follow-up paper to Ashmole and Jim Chapin's work from 1954, and this really is a highlight of what you can get out of a long-term study. So this is using AOS long-term data, and what we did was we plotted first hatch date in successive seasons at Waterside and Mars Bay, the grey and the white bars, from 1996 to the present day. And it really is at the population level, as Ashmole and Jim Chapin said all those years ago, it's a subannual breeding cycle. You can see 366 days is here, where the population, the first hatch dates for the population successive breeding attempts is 296 days. Sorry, 9.6 months, 288 days. And in addition to that, we followed up what Ashmole suggested from the BOU expedition, and we looked at retrapping of birds that were ringed when they were sitting on eggs at day 0 here, and then we look at the times at which they were retrapped out on the fairs, and you can see again that the individuals here are being retrapped at equivalent times in successive breeding seasons at about 9.6 months. So the individuals as well as the population are breeding subannually. So to close the talk, what I was going to do was talk just for a few minutes about the latest bit of stuff we're doing, and this follows on from some really sort of seminal work from particularly on Arctic terns, but also this is Scott Schaefer's work using geolocators and sooty shearwaters. This is a study based in New Zealand showing this huge figure of 8 migration of these birds in one season. Arctic terns were migrating 25,000 kilometres in 12 months. These were birds trapped in Greenland. So we thought, well, we'll have a bit of that. We could put geolocators on sooty terns. So that's what we've been doing. And to date, we've put 50 on birds. We're going to put another 20 out on birds next month. And we're slowly but surely building up a picture of where these birds are going in this 93% of their lives away from the island. So I'm not going to get into the technical side of geolocators, but what they do in a nutshell is with a photosensitive strip pointing out from the bird's leg, which is what you can see here. There's a device on the bird's leg, there's a photosensitive strip, and what it does is it measures sun up, sun down, and from that you can get day length, and you can get latitude and longitude, roughly plus or minus 50 miles. Plus or minus 50 miles, you say, what happens if these birds don't go anywhere? Well, we know they do, and we're predicting they were going long, long distances. And here's just one track from one bird recovered, but the other 6 tracks that we've got from birds are similar to this one. So this is a male that was, geolocator was attached to it 29th of March 2011. We deliberately caught birds that we thought were on the edge of colonies and were going to fail, because we wanted birds to fail early. There's no point putting a tracking device on the bird that's going to spend the next 3 months on the island looking after a late stage egg and then chicks. And sure enough, this bird appeared to leave the island going east. That's day 1 of tracking. And you can see it goes an awfully long way in 8 months. It's going somewhere in the region of just over 24,000 kilometres in 8 months. The most notable thing from this is that it goes nowhere near Africa and nowhere near the Brazilian coast. This is a truly pelagic seabird. The really fascinating thing would be, I hope in my lifetime, that we have devices that will be small enough and last long enough that we can put these on fledglings, because we'd love to know where these birds go for the first 7 or 8 years of their lives. We don't get many recoveries from Ascension sooty terns. We've had 1 recovered in Abidjan that was dying in Abidjan. And we've had some Brazilian birds breeding on Ascension, but we've got no other recoveries to account for, really. But what I do is I go, and particularly in schools, I've just done this with King Edward's School in Birmingham, went and talked to their assemblies, senior and junior, and we got them to adopt a sooty tern. We ran a raffle with it, and we raised more than we needed for 1 geolocator. And what they do is they get to name a sooty tern. They can come up with a name themselves. We give them all the vital information from that geolocator. We give them an idea of how much retrapping effort has gone on. We show them, if we get the device back, where the bird has been, and they get the device as well. So, what about the next 20 years on Ascension? Well, hopefully we won't all look like this on the left-hand side. Some of us look like this now, but still. But the main drives for future research for Ascension, really, are to carry on working a bit with the RSPB about Ascension frigate bird numbers, but that's not our main focus. The debate rages about whether we should be eradicating common minors or just controlling them. Some people like the fact that common minor is on the Ascension bird list. I will sit on the fence on that one. Certainly we need to think about what we do with black rats. That's the key, I think, at the moment. And so when we go in May, 10 of us are going back down to Ascension in May, and we will draw straws again, and we will monitor rat numbers. But we definitely want to continue monitoring where the birds are going. We want to carry on tracking them. And this is working quite a lot with the University of Exeter, who've had Darwin Initiative money, looking to think about bringing a marine protected area kind of idea to Ascension. To do that, we need to come up with species action plans. We need to know where birds are going. And so those are the key things. There's a list of papers. And just to acknowledge a few people and places, RSPB, Ascension Island Government, Biotrack and Lowtech for providing the devices, the AOS, but also RAFOS and RMBWS. These are the 3 military birding organisations. I couldn't have done any of this without John Hughes, who introduced me to the joys of Ascension and continues to enthrall me with his next idea for a paper. And the BTO, obviously, for providing us with permits to do the work. And none of this also would have been possible without Colin, even though he gets savaged by white-tailed tropic birds on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. We've got time for 2 questions. One in the front row here. We'll just get a microphone to you.
From my knowledge of brown miners, they roost in flocks at night in trees. I come from Durban in South Africa, where I've known them all my life, and they are in vast numbers there. If the numbers in Ascension can't yet be that great, I would have thought it was possible to get them as they come into roost, wherever they do roost. They must have a roost somewhere.
They do. They roost. They roost at the rubbish tip, among other places. We know where they are.
Yes.
The population estimate is somewhere between 800 and 1,200 birds.
Yes.
It would be doable to eradicate
them.
them.
It's very difficult to net. I've tried it. And they walk under nets, they walk around them, and I say, oh yes, I know what that is, but different. They're one of the cleverest birds I know.
It sounds like we need your skills down on Ascension.
No, it's interesting about the breeding cycle of the wide awake. It's still thought to be the same as 9.6 meat per month.
Yes.
Because it doesn't breed. They breed annually everywhere else, don't they?
Yes, they do. Yes.
I can remember James Chapin, he did a paper from many years ago. I knew the man himself. He stayed with me in Durban once.
Well, it won't be not a trip down memory lane, but I went to the American Museum of Natural History last year,
Yes.
and I actually went and sampled the birds collected by James Chapin. They'd all got his name written on all the tags on the rings.
Oh, yes.
He lived within a stone's throw of the museum in New York, I think.
Yes, he first went to the Congo.
He did.
To collect birds in 1907. He was there for 7 years. He was the man who found and named the Congo peacock.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Have you given up on the idea of eradicating rats? I thought that they have been successfully eradicated on some islands.
They have. I haven't given up on the idea. I would love it if an individual or army of individuals were prepared to take it on seriously, because I think we would see massive benefits from rat trapping. Because if we don't, I fear that we are, but there's a sort of a party or a faction of conservation biologists who say we should stop meddling. But the problem is we've meddled already. So when do you stop meddling? And I would argue that actually focused effort on black rats would be a very good way forward. Yeah.
I think we'll have
Thank you.
to say no more questions,
Okay.
unfortunately. But Jim, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating talk.